see before us. At times, it's easy for us to reflect about abuse and to talk about abuse, because at times it's so far away from us. But there's other cases where the abuse is quite close. And so if you look at the picture here, you would see that there are many individuals. You have Nene, Jesse, Leandre, Janika, you have Lynette, you have Megan. And these are the names of the faces that we see. These are daughters, these are moms. And so the impact of abuse is actually quite real. And we know that a lot of this has sparked outrage, calling for the government to step in, you know, and I do believe that us as a church, we need to play an important part in mitigating the effects of abuse, and as well as advocating for the rights and the protection of vulnerable groups. And once again, I want to just reiterate that. I want to start off this evening with a story that I came across while just preparing for this. And this is a pastor. The story was in 2013, so it's quite a while back, more than 10 years, probably 10 years back. December the 18th, 2013, and it says here, pastor accused of molesting a 16-year-old family member. And the write-up says that while the world was celebrating Christmas, it says a Memphis pastor was arrested for sexually abusing a 16-year-old family member. What makes this heartbreaking story even more repugnant, they write, is that the church and family members had been informed about the abuse 2 years earlier, but failed to report the crime to the police. Instead, they decided that the best response was simply pray for the offender and hope for the best. Tragically, this response to child sexual abuse by those within the church is not uncommon, they continue, and they say, equally as tragic is that such responses fuels perpetrators to continue destroying the bodies and souls of untold numbers of children. And so this was in Memphis, still quite a distance back away from us. However, there are cases where it is closer home. But I want us to just continue to look at this article. As you read this article, you come across the following, and it says, the disturbing truth is perhaps illustrated by the words of a convicted child molester who told Dr. Salter the following: I consider church people easy to fool. They have a trust that comes from being Christians. They tend to be better folks all around and seem to want to believe in the good that exists in people. And as you can see there, it's written by a convicted sexual offender. And so we see that the church is not immune to this. In actual fact, we at times are more susceptible to fall prey because of our response, because of our belief. We continue, and the question is asked in this article: why is it critical for those within the faith community to be aware of abuse. Why? Well, I guess the first one is that abuse prevalence is higher than we'd want to acknowledge. I was doing some research just to look at some of the stats, and I thought, man, I don't want to to bore you with that, but there is a growing number of cases where people are starting to report abuse involving or not involving, well, involving clergy, but also taking place on church grounds, in church institutions, on or while they are attending church events. And so we see that abuse prevalence is higher than what we want to acknowledge. The author then continues and they make this example. If approximately 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men have been sexually abused as children, and this is very conservative in terms of the stats, this means that our churches are filled with abuse survivors. For example, take a church of 200 members, okay, 100 female, 100 men. They will at least have 41 child sexual abuse survivors. So does abuse happen outside? Or is the church immune to this? And so it then indicates that there's 20.5% of the members that attend might have experienced this. And yet, sexual abuse or discussing abuse is still so seldomly talked about inside the church. How would your church respond if, just think about this, if 20.5% of your congregation had cancer, or 20.5% of your congregation had lost a child, or 20.5% of your congregation had been fired from employment? What do you think would take up the content of what our church would present? Is it safe to predict that addressing this issue would become a primary focus of the church ministry? Is it safe to predict that pastors would preach sermons addressing the spiritual issues associated with trauma? Is it even safe to predict that the church members would expend themselves in love and service to those experiencing such deep hurt? Is it safe to predict that the church would not respond to this criminal offense in silence? And so, as a faith community, we must learn to approach the horror of abuse no differently. Perhaps these statistics can help drive our faith communities to become places of refuge and healing for abuse survivors who are silently suffering in our midst. There's an article that I want to just read as well. And this brings together this concept of grooming and yet it taking place within the church. And this was written by, I can't get to the name now, by Geoff McMaster. And this was also written in 2020. Part of this speaks about the abuse of authority. And so it says the following, Rain and Kent defines sexual grooming as a gradual sexualization of a relationship between a person with religious authority and a child or teen, becoming or beginning with non-sexual touching that progresses over time to sexual contact. Whereby the child may not even understand the abusive or improper nature of the behavior. And why I'm reading this is just to outline to you how this grooming and the culture of authority and the trust that takes place in the church can actually create a context in which abuse can take place. And so let me continue, and this is what it says. Perpetrators, who may include religious or spiritual leaders, volunteers, camp counselors in religious-based camps, staff in religious schools, or others associated with religious communities, prepare the child and significant adults and create an environment for abuse, says Rain. In addition to gaining access to a child, they aim to earn trust and compliance while maintaining secrecy to avoid disclosure. Often by the time the abuse actually happens, the child feels they have given consent, says Rain. It continues and it says, abusers draw not only on their positions of power and authority as adults, which is potent in itself, but also the assertion about God's will, which is the ultimate unquestionable authority for religious adherence, and a figure that can inspire fear as much as it can awe and love. So when this abuse is disclosed, it is often met with skepticism, and this is in the context of the church, and denial, even by the child's family. And this is particularly within the church setting. And it continues, it says the following, because devotion to the institution shapes social identity, especially for more devout individuals, members of a religious community may be entirely suspicious of the victim's claims. You hear that? Entirely suspicious of the victim's claims, favoring instead the religious figure and his or her status and perceived credibility. In some cases, an entire society may be groomed, said Rain. She points to Ireland where a whole nation exhibited a culture of disbelief towards abuse claims after widespread revelation of abuse in the 90s. Members may have a greater loyalty to the institution than to the abused victim. Another instance, they continue and they say, in Nigeria, the researchers found that some Pentecostal pastors groom children under the pretext of freeing them from demonic possession, using exorcism as a euphemism for sexual assault. The pastors were protected by the absolute trust that the community has in them, says Kent and Rain. Family members without religious authority may also exploit the family's faith in grooming a child, using familiar religious rhetoric and convincing the child that abuse is perfectly acceptable in the eyes of God. So while much of the evidence is disturbing, Rain warns us against creating a moral panic. And so this is what the article ends off. It says, you don't want people to start assuming that every coach, priest, or pastor, or minister, or child leader is going to try and groom and assault your child, she says. But it is important for people to understand that most sexual abuse doesn't happen because someone abducts your child from a public park. It's usually a family member, extended family member, or someone they know in the community, whether religious or otherwise, who is often responsible. And so, why am I starting with this? There has been many times where I have come across where the initial response of the church is disbelief. And yet, if you understand how grooming comes into play, if you understand how power imbalances come into play, it then makes sense that even within the church, that there might be cases of abuse. And that the church is not in its own right exempted from this. And so hence it is important for us to be mindful of this. There's another aspect that they raise in this article that says that those who sexually victimize children, and this is, friends, in the context of sexual abuse, um, who sexually victimize children likely have victimized dozens of other children during their lifetime. And so not only does this open our eyes to the prevalence of this tragic epidemic, but it should also help us equip ourselves to respond to individuals within our faith community who get caught for engaging in criminal behavior against children and begs for grace, claiming that this was the only child that they have ever victimized. So based upon the statistics, the offender is often likely lying, which means they are continuing to deceive in order to reestablish trust and access to children. And so perhaps when we reflect on the prevalence of abuse, this can help drive our faith communities to open our eyes to what is possibly there. Why am I saying this? Because there are times when you deal with cases, many times we find, which was part of my experience at times, that the disbelief of churches in terms of the victim murkies the water even more. And so abuse cases is very, very complex at times. But a church that denies to believe a victim when a victim discloses tends to complicate the matters more. Let us continue. It says here that most children never report sexual abuse, and when they do, it is often ignored. So most children never feel the need then to disclose it. Similarly, the young girl in Memphis can sadly attest to this. Perhaps these stories or these insights will prompt our faith community to once again actively educate our members about this crime and the dialogue, and to have open dialogue about the issues with our children. There's two key components of such education, which is prevention and response. How do we prevent this from happening? And how do we as a church respond when things like this happens? There are times that we will never be able to prevent all the abuse. Maybe I don't necessarily foresee that. But however, it's also important for us as a church to be able to respond appropriately to abuse. So while you consider your case or you hear this presentation, how has your church responded to abuse? It is important for us to envision an environment, a society where our children particularly are safe. The duty of a child is to play, to learn, to grow, and to develop, and much more within our church. And so we must be able to understand that that is the environment that we must create. So the question that we need to then ask is, what is our point of departure regarding abuse as a church? And so we find that the restoration of mankind into the image of God is the central theme of the story of redemption. And so we have a duty as a church, friends, to protect and advance the safety and security of the weak and the vulnerable. We have a duty to establish a safe and secure church environment. We also have a duty to create standards aimed at their protection. And so abuse in its various forms is not only, or abuse in its various forms, not only in the number, but in the intensity, is on the increase. And the devastating and long-term results of that is deeply devastating to individuals who have experienced this. The sorrow and the impact that abuse causes, not only to the victims and to those in close relations with him, but also to society, cannot be ignored. And so the church, in light of its mission and philosophy, has a positive responsibility to fulfill towards those who are victims of violence and abuse. And a neglect of this duty, friends, should not be tolerated. Furthermore, as a church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church does not condone or approve any form of abuse or violence against any child or any person, especially those belonging to the vulnerable groups. So I'm giving you a sense of what our point of departure is as a church. Furthermore, we support the legal and social processes which are aimed at preventing such atrocities. And in support of these governmental goals, our responsibility is to report any such occurrence and to actively pursue preventative measures in order to make our churches and institutions a place of safety and healing. And so the church has, friends, a significant role to play, both in abuse, the reporting cases of abuse, as well as ministering to those affected by abuse. And so at times, there are cases where the victim or the survivor and the alleged perpetrator or perpetrator and their families are in the same church. And so how do we as a church respond and minister to those needs? And maybe that is something that we will need to look at Yada, when we maybe later in the year. How do we respond and minister to those affected by abuse? The next thing that we look at is, so how does a church seek to outline its response to vulnerable abuse? And that is through the development of the vulnerable persons abuse prevention policy. And this policy has a number of items that we look at. So it has objectives, definitions, reporting of abuse, reporting of sexual abuse, reporting of abuse of elderly, and then the abuse prevention official, reporting methods and procedures, abuse prevention mechanisms, and discipline. And so we won't go through all of these items, but we will look at what we can cover for this evening. So what is the purpose of a policy within an organization? Organizational policies establish boundaries, guidelines, and best practices for acceptable behavior within an organization. And so by virtue of us being part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we then ascribe and hold to what is outlined in this policy. And so the question is, what is the purpose of the vulnerable persons abuse prevention policy? Well, we can see here that it says the object of this policy is to ensure mandatory reporting, to implement preventative and disciplinary measures and processes, and to have proper record-keeping mechanisms, so that we as a church could also understand and track this within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so when we look at this, mandatory reporting, the object of this policy is to ensure that all forms of abuse and violence which carries a mandatory reporting requirement in terms of national legislation be reported immediately and effectively to the relevant authorities in order to combat sexual offenses and any other forms of abuse in the church. And so this idea of mandatory reporting, friends, there's no option for us to report. We cannot take, once someone discloses to us this matter, to the elders board, and then the elders board will take it to the church board, and then the church board will decide whether they want to report the matter or not. This policy indicates that there are mandatory reportable offenses, and once you are aware of and abuse. And by the way, there's also no timeline to when abuses can take place. So if abuse happened 20 years ago, that can still be reported and investigated. But the idea is here that the church does not have an option. The pastor does not have an option. The youth leader does not have an option of whether or not. If it is that it is being discovered that you know about the abuse, but you fail to report it, you can be held liable to a fine or even imprisonment. So that's according to the Children's Act, as well as the Sexual Offences Act. Yeah. Furthermore, to ensure that mandatory reporting, this policy will deal specifically with mandatory reportable offences. So what is mandatory reportable offences? Well, it's child sexual abuse and pornography, sexual abuse of the mentally disabled, any forms of abuse against children which are, for instance, deliberate neglect, abuse which causes physical harm, and then abuse of the elderly. And so once again, we're seeing how this ties into the presentation of Monday evening. I want to just also highlight this idea of pornography. I think it is important that we start talking to our young people about this. Because with the onset of cell phones and technology, we have seen an increase in the recording of sexual acts that involve children. So for instance, I'm a young person, I catch my friends, him and his girlfriend busy in some type of act, sexual act, I record them, I then circulate that and send it via social media to other friends. I can be subject to, or I can be held accountable and be reported because I am producing and circulating pornography, particularly of involving children. And so we need to explain this to our youth as well, who might at times do this unknowingly, but then fall prey to being exposed and having to go through a legal system because of the fact that they have circulated that. Furthermore, we also need to touch base on with physical injuries. We come from a society that use corporal punishment as a form of discipline. Corporal punishment is outrightly banned, both in the institution and within the home. And so gone are the days where parents or teachers or deacons or so in the church use that form of discipline on children, because if that happens, you are then assaulting the child. And once you assault the child, it is a mandatory reportable offense, and hence you need to report that matter to the police to be investigated. And so those two we need to be aware of, because it's very gray, and we've dealt with cases where it involved children recording their friends, and it was tantamount to producing and spreading of child pornography. So we need to make notes of that and be open to discuss it with our children. Let us continue. That was just on a side note. To implement preventative and disciplinary measures and procedures, that's part of the policy. Furthermore, is also to have proper record keeping. Okay? And it's important that we as a church also monitor and record cases of abuse, so that we can also understand how it is affecting us. When we look at the national framework, it's just also interesting to see once again that mandatory reportable offences is outlined in the national legislative framework. So you have the Children's Act, which speaks on protecting the rights of children. You have the Child Justice Act, Children in Conflict with the Law, the Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Related Matters Act, which expounds on what constitutes on sexual offences. You have the Film and Publications Act, which expounds and prohibits child pornography once again. And then you have also Older Persons Act. And so these legislative documents guides and also help develop our policy as a church. And so mandatory reportable offenses, once again, I've gone through that. So that is fine. Once I just want to also highlight what is a vulnerable group, and that is for our liking children, persons living with mental disabilities, and older persons. So this policy covers a broader group and not just particularly, for instance, children. So we just need to be aware of that. So what does this policy require employees of the conference or the church, as well as church members to do regarding the knowledge of abuse? And when we look at abuse, I just took this out of the Children's Act, just to give you an understanding of how they define abuse. So abuse in relation to a child means any form of harm or ill treatment deliberately inflicted on a child, and includes assaulting a child or inflicting any form of deliberate injury on a child. We see the corporal punishment coming in there. Sexually abusing a child or allowing a child to be sexually abused. So you know about it, but because you keep quiet, you're allowing that abuse to take place. Bullying by another child, a labor practice that exploits a child, and exposing or subjecting a child to behavior that may harm the child psychologically or emotionally. So that constitutes abuse when it comes to a child. Let us continue. An employee or church member who has knowledge or who on a reasonable grounds concludes that a child has been sexually abused must immediately report such knowledge or reasonable conclusion to a child protection organization or a police official and the local conference abuse official. And so when you look at the legal documents, it will say to a designated child protection organization, the Department of Social Development, or a police station or police official. But what I want to just highlight to you is that when it comes to sexual abuse matters, you must report to a police station. So according to the Sexual Offences Act, you must then report the matter to the police. Why am I saying this? When it comes to any other types of abuse, it gives you the option to report it to a designated child protection organization or the Department of Social Development or the police. But when it comes specifically to sexual abuse cases, this must be reported to the police. The police will then follow the process in terms of dealing with it. And if it is that the child is in any way in danger, then they would then look at bringing in the social worker to ensure the safety of the child. Let us continue. A pastor, a religious leader, a teacher, a medical practitioner, or a nurse who is an employee of an organization and who on a reasonable grounds conclude that a child has been deliberately neglected or physically abused must immediately report such conclusions to a child protection organization or a police official and the local APO. And there are particular forms that we need to use. So for instance, when we report abuse of a child, we use the Form 22. When we report the abuse of some mentally disabled individual or a report abuse of an elderly person, there is prescribed forms that the designated organization will use for you to complete. However, when it comes to children, it is specifically clear that we must use a Form 22 in order to report abuse. So we need to understand that. So when it comes to the reporting of abuse, we understand that we have the designated child protection organization, police, social workers, hospitals, schools. In our case, as this policy highlights, we need to look at the conference, APO, the head of the institution, and the local pastor. So if you have abuse happening, a particular case within your church, you will have a local APO and your local pastor. You need to inform about that. If you are at a church school, you would have a principal, which is the institution head, and the institution head would also then inform the conference APO. When you look at the local church, on local church level, you would see there that you will have the local pastor, the local APO, and the board. When the abuse was done by a local church member or taken place at a church program, you will then particularly involve your church board. Because apart with the reporting of the case, as a church, you need to then institute particular processes to safeguard and to support the victim and the perpetrator. So I've touched on child pornography, but it also says the employee who is knowledgeable or who has knowledge or suspects that a person unlawfully possesses, creates, or produces, or in any way contributes to or assists in the creation or production or distribution or making available of child pornography. It continues and says, or advocates and promotes child pornography. An employee who has a knowledge or suspects must report such knowledge or suspicion to a police official. And so once again, it's just highlighting that the policy also particularly makes provision for child pornography. So how should we report suspected or alleged disclosure of abuse? So let's look at that. Firstly, the reporting method and procedures. A report in terms of this policy must be made in the prescribed format. And like I told you, with children, it's the Form 22. With the older person and the mentally disabled individuals, there's no specific prescribed form as yet. So what you would do is you would then just report that matter and they would then take your statement down with regards to that. However, when it comes to children, it is the Form 22 that we will use to report that. Then, once you have the Form 22 and you have completed it, a copy of the completed form must be forwarded to the APO. The APO must assist the reporter to successfully report the alleged offences, and both the reporter and the APO must keep a record of the report, and specifically the date, time, and person to whom the report was made. It is important for you to take note of that. Who, the date, the time, and to who you made the report. There was one case where an individual went to the police station and wanted to report the matter, and then was sent away and did not have the record of who they spoke to. It then came out that there was an allegation that there was no report made, and because they didn't have that information, it was difficult just to corroborate that. But that's why it is important to know the date, time, and with who you spoke to. Furthermore, in circumstances where no specific reporting format is prescribed, like the older persons or with people living with disabilities, the report must be made to the relevant authority in a manner and method approved by the said authority. Okay? And there was also that care must be taken by the APO and the reporter that in such circumstances, he or she must obtain proof of reporting in the form of an official issued case number or events register number or any other similar method. So what we normally say is once abuse takes place or is disclosed, the local APO will then have to report that matter. Once the matter is reported and there is a case number, that case number is then given to the local or taken to the church board, indicating that there is a case opened against a particular individual. And hence the church now needs to put in protective measures and also look at dealing with the individual. So the reporter must ensure that the said case number, events register, be provided to the APO for record purposes. Now, I've been speaking about APO, and APO is just a short word term for the abuse prevention official. Okay, and what is the purpose of the abuse prevention official? So each local church should have a local abuse prevention official. The conference has appointed a conference abuse prevention official, and each church must have a local abuse prevention official. And part of the work is, number one, to ensure reporting, number two, to look at training and awareness, and the third is record management. So that is in a nutshell what the APO official does. It also says that the local church must appoint or designate an APO, and all entities must appoint an abuse prevention committee. And so if you look at the structure of your local church, you would have the local APO structure. You would then have what we call your APO, which on a local church level will be your local APO, and then you will have your APO committee. And what is the purpose of this? When we look at the proposed structure, your local APO, together with your local pastor and your local head elder, becomes the case management committee. So those three individuals will, because of the sensitivity of abuse and the disclosure of abuse, those three individuals will be tasked with managing the case. Managing the case would mean ensuring that it's reported, that there's proper communication done with the victim and the perpetrator, should they be in the same church, and also keep the board abreast of any developments in the case. But added to that, you will then also have what we call the local abuse prevention committee. And that committee is then involves all three or all of these leaders. And the committee's role is particularly to look at arranging awareness programs, particularly to look at arranging trainings, and any type of other needs with regards to early, or not early intervention, but awareness raising when it comes to abuse. However, on a local level, you would have the local APO, the local pastor, and the local head elder, who becomes the committee that manages the case. And the reason for that is that because of the sensitivity of the disclosure, it would then be better to keep it within a smaller group, but to ensure that it is then that group's duty is to communicate with the APO at the conference, but also to ensure that the matter or the abuse or the disclosure of abuse is reported to the officials. It is not kept within that committee for them to decide whether or not to report. But it is to ensure that there is a proper process followed in reporting of the matter. That committee also needs to then communicate to the local church board on the progress of the case. And that's in a nutshell, particularly the structure that we have outlined for local church. So when you look at the responsibility of the APO, it's to receive all the reports, it's to ensure that all reportable incidences are properly and effectively reported, and to ensure that proper records are kept. Furthermore, to provide or cause to provide ministerial care to all parties involved. And this is what we need to understand. that if it is that the alleged victim and the alleged perpetrator are in the same church, the church still has a responsibility to provide ministerial care to both parties. And there's where we need to then ensure that there's either the pastor that will work with the perpetrator and another individual working with the family. But we must be able to provide ministerial care to the families. That is not saying that we will not hold accountable those that need to be held accountable. That's not what we are saying. Or that we even condoning the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator's behavior. But it's just with the fact that we need to still provide ministerial care to both parties. Furthermore, to provide training for the churches, that's also the abuse prevention officials' duty. What I also want to highlight is that the APO will need to take the reasonable care that the integrity of any investigative process or the reporting of any incident in accordance with these policies are not jeopardized or interfered with or obstructed by any person or committee. It is important for us to understand that we as a church cannot get involved in the investigation of a matter, other than when we are guided by the authorities that are investigating the matter. We are also not to establish our committee that will go and investigate. That is not our duty. Our duty is only to report mandatory reportable offenses and then also to support the victims, and in this case also if the alleged abusers in the church, we need to support the family of the alleged abuser as well. And so what I've seen in some cases was where the local church elders will get involved in the matter and want to go counsel and reconcile the victim and the perpetrator while the investigation is going on. And that is not the case. It is not also the local elder or church board's duty to go speak to the people to withdraw the matter so that we can cover up. My advice is that we must allow the investigation to take place without any interference from the church, because in that way we would be able to understand, is there any risk? Is there, number one, any veracity to the allegations? And number two, is there any future risk that the church needs to prevent? And if we get involved and try to persuade the people to withdraw the case and to reconcile when it's not the appropriate time, we jeopardize the whole investigative process. And so, friends, remember, it's our duty to report, not to investigate. We don't appoint an investigating committee that will go and interview the perpetrator and go and interview the alleged or the victim or so. We must just ensure that the matter is reported. We will then also support the investigation by providing information that we have at hand, and we will then also provide support both to the victim and the perpetrator. At this point in time, if the investigation is not confirmed, we then refer to it as the alleged victim and the alleged perpetrator. Only once there is a finding made, then we can then say perpetrator or victim. Okay. Friends, I would want to, I'm looking at the time, Yada. I wanted to know, should I continue or should we maybe look at completing this on Sabbath?
I think we can complete the prevention mechanisms on Sabbath.
Okay. Okay.
Yes. So I'm opening the floor up to questions right now. There is a question. I don't know if Adolf, you feel like it was answered. The question is sexual abuse an automatic criminal offense that should be reported to the law enforcement, i.e. police? And once reported, in addition, what is the church's laid down protocol, if any, that should be followed once sexual abuse has been reported?
Yes. So what I was thinking of, Yana, was particularly on if it was allowed, I could outline the process that the church can take, a suggested process. Normally, when it comes to that, number one, it must be reported to the police. Number two, once a case has been made, I would then indicate that or maybe advise then that we take that matter to the church board, because at that point in time, then we'll be able to say there has been a case opened against a particular individual. The church board now needs to act against that individual. So, for instance, if the individual is a leader in the church board would then need to then take the action that would say, pending the outcome of the investigation, you will not be able to fulfill your leadership roles. You will be able to attend church. Depending on the severity of the allegations, you can even then add to that to say you need to have a chaperone. You cannot attend children's events if it involves children. So the church board then will be able to then to make that action or to take those particular actions and then inform that individual. But it is sometimes very sensitive in terms of how you need to deal with it. And hence I say, you know, it's good to have the local APO with the local pastor and the local head elder as the case management team, who needs to then communicate with the church board the progress of the matter. Do you understand? I hope that kind of like gives a response to the question. I can also provide, we are currently looking at enhancing the policy and providing more clear-cut guidelines for local churches to follow when dealing with cases like that. So I can share that with you once it has gone through the local, or not the local, but through the powers as be, you know. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Adolf, for your answer. Or Nonto, Adolf and Nonto.
Yes, we answered. Thank you so much. But we have another question, maybe after others have asked.
Okay. So there's a question here that says, so someone comes and tells you that they're being abused, right? But they say that they're not ready for it to be reported. What do you do in that situation?
Yeah. So remember we dealt with disclosure a bit on Monday evening. So I think it's once again to provide a reassurance and to also explain and validate what the person has stated. Thereafter, you need to also explain that if it is that it falls within the mandatory reportable offenses, there is an obligation for you to report the matter. So what would happen is that if it, for instance, if it's a child that discloses to you, you need to then report the matter. There's no keeping it a secret or so, but you need to explain that to the child. That thank you for sharing what you have told me. I believe what you have said. The best one way to deal with this is the following. I need to, number one, report it to the authorities. And once I report it, we will then be able to help and support you through the process of the investigation. So my advice is that you just be clear to the child, and obviously use plain language, for instance, if it is a child, just to explain that you cannot keep it a secret. You need to inform the church, not the church, the authorities. If it involves a church member, then you need to also inform the church through the church board.
Yeah.
And there's times, for instance, that we have individuals that attends church at your local church, but that's not a member. There's also times where there's church people or alleged perpetrators that are church members. in both that cases, you need to put protective measures in place. And the best way to deal with that is through your local church board. So I hope you get the sense that you have your management team, but your local church board helps you to take actions to help protect and support the individuals involved.
Okay, thank you for that. So there's another question. How does the church balance its restorative role and its role to protect everyone from abuse? For instance, in a case where abuse has been reported and the accused has not been arrested yet, or the accused is out on bail, should the accused be allowed to attend church services as this? This is in light of the fact that the victim may be uncomfortable being in the same space as the abuser.
So each case would be dependent on the severity of the abuse. And so I would say that it would need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So for instance, the church, through the church board, would then have one church board, and then if needs be through the business meeting, can then implement further protective measures. So for instance, if it is, let's go for a worst case, there's an individual, and it's just purely speculative, individual that rapes a child. The child comes, they disclose that. The church board can add, in my view, I would recommend further protective measures. So for instance, you could say that you are not allowed to attend church, or if you attend church, you need to have a chaperone, and that person needs to be designated, so he follows you wherever you go. You cannot attend any church programs where children will be, and things like that. So you can, in my view, put those measures in place to protect. However, you can also state then further that to help you in terms of ministry, the pastor will reach out to you once a week and have a prayer with you, or a designated elder would do that. Did you understand? So in that sense, you are still ensuring that the ministerial needs of the individual is met, but there's still protective measures that prevents any further risk of children being abused, or so. Does that make, I hope that answers the question.
Vuyo, are you answered?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Okay, Adolf and Nanta, I think you guys.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to find out how to go about reporting a matter and investigating it. I think what was said was that once a matter is reported, an abuse matter is reported by the victim, it should be reported to the authorities. But I'm just a little bit concerned because we've had instances or read stories where the victim is an older person who probably just wanted to fix someone, for instance, and they accuse them of raping them. And then the accused goes to jail, and then later on, after a couple of years, find out, no, it wasn't true, it never happened, and they were all lies. But we have already reported the matter to the authorities without having had to investigate. So how do we balance that?
Yeah. So the legislative framework does make provision for you to report abuse, suspected abuse, on in good faith. So for instance, I'm starting with this. So for instance, if someone reports to you that they are being abused, your duty is to report that to the authorities. Should it come out later that that person has lied about it, and the investigation supports that lies, then there is no grounds for them to come and sue you for making the case. So the Act provides that cover for you to report matters in good faith. That's number one. I just also want to say that I've worked with sexual abuse cases where the victim recants, and recanting a story does not necessarily mean that the abuse did not happen. And I'm saying this particularly with sexual abuse. Many times, like I've explained in Monday, I dealt with one case where the child came forward to say, this is what the stepfather is doing to me. And the moment the whole system went in place, in terms of protecting the safety, removing the child, placing the child in foster care, in a place of safety, all of those things were done. The child would come back and say, but this was a lie. And the motivation for that was, disclosure was not because she wanted to be, disclosure was she wanted the abuse to stop, not to be placed in a place of safety with other children out of our house and things like that. So there are unintended consequences that sometimes forces children to recant their story, but does not mean that the abuse did not happen. So that was some of my experience that I've seen while working with cases like this. However, as a church and as an individual, we have the duty to report, number one. We do not have the duty to investigate. And by us by us acting or wanting to investigate the matter can further complicate the matter. So for instance, it is believed, and I want to believe that there are professionals who knows how to interrogate and speak to a child. There are investigative officers who understands the signs, the complexities of abuse cases. And so by us wanting to go out and establish first whether this abuse has happened, and in some cases not even having the experience to do that, can complicate the matter further and add or expose the individual to further abuse. And so I want you to understand that the policy requires us to only report. It is not our duty to set it up so that we can catch a perpetrator in the act. And once we have the perpetrator in the act, and then we want to report the matter. Because in that sense, we are then exposing the individual to further abuse. It is also my belief that we need to ensure the integrity of the investigative process. And we must be able to support that, because it is once the investigation has been done without interference that we as a church would be able to really determine what is the right and fair process. Because for us, it's not necessarily about just getting the victim, making sure he's never see the light of day. For us, is what is fair. Because within the legal system, there's also this: you are guilty until you are proven. Not just you are innocent until you are proven guilty. So for us, reporting does not imply that you are. We don't know. We are not calling any how can I say, conclusions. We are saying this is what has come to us. The best people to investigate this are the authorities. Let them investigate this, and let them then provide us with the facts. And based on the facts, we can then act. I wouldn't want to speculate whether someone goes to prison for not, how can I say, for being innocent. There were cases like that, but I wouldn't want to speculate on how much and things like that. I would want us to look at what is our role and for us not to act in ways that will complicate the investigative process. For instance, I've seen some cases where, because of pressure from the local church leaders, the family of the victim feels excluded, the family of the victims feel victimized. And because of that, and the role that the church plays within their life, they would rather say, no, the abuse didn't happen.
Mm.
Irrespective of us finding out whether it did or not. And in that case, imagine if it did happen. The risk that is there for future children or people that are there. So I would really strongly recommend that we do not, as a church, go and investigate. That is not our role. Our mandate is to report these events and to ensure that we manage the case in a sensitive manner. And that's why I'm also saying that up until there is a finding, we refer to it as the alleged victim, the alleged perpetrator, because it's still allegations up until there's a finding where we can then say, this is what the report states from an independent authority, and hence we are acting in a particular way. So I hope that covers you with that.
Adolph, are you answered?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much.
Okay, any more questions before we close? It's almost 8 o'clock. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you for your patience.
Any more questions? I have lots of questions, but I'll keep them for Sabbath afternoon.
Sister Yada?
Yes.
No, it's not a question, but just a comment to really thank you and the team and Brother Jeremy or Pastor Jeremy for such an insightful topic. I know it's something that we tend to want to shy away from discussing, but I think it's been such an informative discussion, and I've personally really learned quite a lot from this discussion. So just to say thank you very, very much. We are definitely living in difficult times. I also want to add, yesterday the discussion, or on Monday rather, the discussion came up, one of the points came up about grooming. And in fact, just this week, Carte Blanche launched or highlighted a case that they were investigating where two school-going children actually committed suicide because the coaches, the swimming coaches or whatever coaches were grooming them. And that then led to sexual abuse and all of those kinds of things. The children were affected and they ended up committing suicide. And that those cases are actually being investigated. So these are real things that are happening. And I think we cannot distance ourselves from the unfortunate reality of what is going on in this world. And it is sad that these kinds of events are infiltrating the church. And it puts us in a really, really difficult position because you ought to love your brother and behave in a Christian manner towards them. Yet on the other hand, you're hearing that they might have committed or done something, allegedly done something. So it puts the church in a very, very difficult position. And so I think these kinds of discussions are really, really needed. So just thank you very much for this. We really appreciate these discussions. Thank you.
Amen. Any more questions? Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Okay, in the absence of any more questions, on Friday, we're going to be talking about gender-based violence, red flags, white flags, and how to equip yourself to get out, to help our loved ones, and even ourselves if we find ourselves in those types of situations and relationships. Please keep your questions on Sabbath afternoon. We're going to have a summary of the week, and then we're going to have a question and answer session. If you are shy to ask your questions, please forward them to me. I will be glad to forward them to Jeremy so that he can also prepare if he needs to, so that we can make it a fruitful exercise. So yeah, Jeremy, please close in prayer for us.
Okay, let us pray. Dear God, we thank you for the opportunity you have given us to share and discuss the Lord, an important matter that we as a church need to look at and reflect on, dear God. And I pray, dear Lord, that you would help us to be wise and tactful, and to also be where we are planning ahead, dear Lord, for things like this, and not just reactive to when it happens, but help us to be proactive, dear God, to mitigate the abuse and the effects thereof within our church and in our communities, dear God. Thank you so much for the leadership, and I pray a blessing upon the church in Mowbray, dear God. I pray this prayer in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.